All right, guys, final unit is titled A New Worldview, and mostly what we will cover in this unit is a period that's sometimes referred to as a scientific revolution, and specifically how new scientific discoveries, um, for many people, called into question certain traditional religious beliefs and changed the economy and created a new worldview. Um, the Age of Exploration, so that's that period that we've covered previously with Columbus and Magellan, etc., led to new technologies that facilitated or made easier any number of things, trade, travel, scientific inquiry. And this begins what we can call a self-perpetuating cycle, right? Once um, a tendency towards progress, I guess, takes hold and reaches a certain critical mass, it just keeps going, right? And it speeds up and it becomes a self-perpetuating cycle. Um, some of the inventions or developments, I guess is a better word from this period, the modern telescope and the modern microscope. And both of those are great examples of a self-perpetuating cycle in the sense that they each lead to new discoveries, and those new discoveries lead to newer discoveries. And then it's just, a boulder rolling down a hill, right? There's no stopping it once it builds up uh, a certain momentum. And this is the world that we've all inherited, where the rate of progress is incredibly rapid. We may take it for granted because it's all we know, but it is a new thing in human history. The idea that during your lifetime, the world will change radically, that's new, right? And it starts during this period here. So, starting with these events, history moves more quickly, is the saying. Not literally, of course, but well, I guess you could say it is literal. Um, things change much more rapidly in the last 300 years, and again, it's speeding up, right? So in the last 20 years, things have changed more rapidly, and that shows no sign of slowing down, for better or for worse. Things happen much more quickly. Um, here's an example from the 20th century. And again, we're all on the edge, the outer edge of this process that begins a few hundred years ago with the scientific revolution. 20th century, think about this, the rate of progress here. 20th century, the very beginning of the century, 1903, I believe, the first powered flight, the Wright brothers, right? You probably heard of that. And they flew what to us is a very primitive piece of equipment, but it was the first powered flight. And they flew about 120 feet over a beach in North Carolina. And that was a revolutionary breakthrough. Think about it like this. It took all of human history, however you define that, whatever number you want to put on it. It took all of human history to figure out how to fly 120 feet. All of human history. And if you think about the amount of time elapsed between the first powered flight and the first moon landing, it was 66 years between these two events. Now, landing on the moon is infinitely more complex than flying 120 feet over a beach in a little balsa wood glider with like a moped engine strapped to it, basically. Right? Flying 120 feet over a beach versus flying 500,000 miles round trip through the vacuum of outer space, those are not comparable. The moon landing was infinitely more complex than the first flight, but there's only 66 years that elapsed between the two of them. Now, if the rate of progress were constant, the amount of times that elapsed between these two events should have been billions of years. If it took, however you want to define the beginning of humanity, let's say what scientists say is the emergence of Homo sapiens, the scientists say about 300,000 years ago. Modern humans emerged. Okay. It took 300,000 years to figure out how to do what the Wright brothers did. 300,000 years. Let's round that up to 500,000. Given how much more complex it is to fly to the moon than it is to do what the Wright brothers did, if it took 500,000 years to figure out how to fly 120 feet over a beach, it should have taken billions of years because it's thousands of times more complex to land on the moon. But it didn't take billions of years. It took 66 years. It took an average human lifetime. That rate of progress is it's incredible in the literal sense of the word. It's not believable. The rate of progress technologically for all of human history goes like this. It's a flat line with little blips. And then starting with the scientific revolution, the rate grows exponentially. Boom, through the roof rocket ship. Exponential growth. That's history moving more quickly. The world changes in the average human lifetime now more than it would change in 10,000 years historically. That's what we're dealing with. And then the philosophical question is, all right, our technology is evolving rapidly, for better or for worse. Does our morality, our wisdom, our self-control also evolve that rapidly? This is kind of an esoteric question, but that's of great concern to some people for reasons that we'll get into a little bit later. But again, the fact that there could have been, let's say, a 10-year-old kid on this beach watching the Wright brothers fly, and it's the first time humans ever flew. And he's 10 years old and he's witnessing that amazing breakthrough in human history. By the time that 10-year-old kid is 76 years old, he's old, but he's 76. He's still alive. He's kicking. He's sitting in his easy chair with his grandkids, watching TV, watching people walk on the moon. That's ridiculous. But that's how quickly history moves now. And it's speeding up even more. All right. And with AI on the horizon, I mean, who knows? Right. That's the new reality. But it's new. In the course of human history, it's new. The rule in human history was that the world as you know it isn't that much different than it would have been 1,000 years before you were born. Now that's done. That's over. Now the world as we know it is almost unrecognizable from what it was even 50 years ago, right? History is moving more quickly. One of the first scientific breakthroughs that was made, which was in part made possible by the development of better telescopes, was called the Copernican hypothesis. Copernicus was a astronomer, and he proved and went from a hypothesis, a theory, to a proven scientific fact, what's called heliocentric model. And on the image here, heliocentric is what's pictured below on the bottom of your screen. Helio means sun, centric means in the middle. And Copernicus proved what we all now know is that the sun is in the center of our solar system. For all of human history up to that point, the huge majority of people, almost everybody essentially, believed in geocentric, geo meaning Earth, that the Earth is in the center. And that's what's pictured above. Now, why would people think, and now we know that that's not accurate, geocentric isn't accurate. Why would people think that the Earth was in the center and that the sun is orbiting around us? Why would people think that? It's not because they were stupid. Uh, it's because they were very smart, actually, and knew how to use basic powers of observation and common sense. Why wouldn't you believe in geocentric? It's what we can observe, that the sun is moving in orbits around us. I can observe that. I observe that every day. I get up in the morning, it's dark outside. I go outside with my cup of coffee. I can see the sun rising. I can see it moving. I'm recording this in late morning. The sun is significantly higher in the sky than it was when I got up. And at the end of the day today, it's going to get dark because the sun goes down. We can see the sun moving every day. So why wouldn't we think that it's moving? We're literally watching it move. So people that believe this weren't stupid. And this is a hard sell. Imagine Copernicus comes along. Well, Galileo, actually, we'll get to that in a minute. But imagine a scientist comes along and he says to you, um, you know how you can see the sun moving through the sky all day, every day? Well, actually, it's not moving, even though you're watching it move. Trust me, I am a scientist. The thing that you see happening isn't happening. The sun isn't moving. Don't believe your lying eyes. Actually, we on Earth are moving. We are hurtling through space in big orbits around the sun, and every day we spin on our axis. So the thing you see moving, the sun, isn't moving, and the thing that you can't feel moving, the Earth, actually is moving. Take my word for it, I'm a scientist. It's a hard sell, right? So a lot of people didn't believe this, but right, life is crazy that way. It turns out it's true. The thing that we see moving, the sun, isn't moving. We're moving, even though we can't feel the earth moving beneath our feet. It actually is. It's crazy. And there were, for certain people, religious implications to this because it was not just a scientific belief, but a religious belief for many people that the earth was in the center of the universe. And so this scientific breakthrough did undermine certain traditional religiously held beliefs of the centrality of the earth. The earth is not in the center of the universe. The earth is not in the center of our solar system. And by the way, as we learn more and more through astronomy, our solar system is on the outer edge of a galaxy, which is one galaxy among billions. And we don't even know how many planets. I don't know if there's a good faith estimate, trillions. So the centrality of the earth as a religious belief was really undermined by these scientific breakthroughs. The trial of Galileo, I can talk. Copernicus proved heliocentric theory, but he didn't publish his proof while he was alive, because he was scared of what eventually happened to Galileo. So Galileo confirmed that Copernicus was correct. And unlike Copernicus, Galileo published his findings while he was still alive, and he was put on trial by the Catholic Church. And this is a quote from St. Bellarmine was, you can see, a cardinal in the church at the time. And this is an infamous quote from the trial of Galileo. To assert that the earth revolves around the sun is as erroneous as to claim that Jesus was not born of a virgin. So it's a very telling quote for a couple of reasons. And I think the most important thing for you to consider here is that this quote indicates that this person was incapable of separating two specific types of thought or worldview, if you will. To assert that the earth revolves around the sun. Well, it does. Copernicus proved it, Galileo proved it. It does. Heliocentric theory is correct. The Earth revolves around the sun, not vice versa, even though everyone believed that forever up until this point. That is a question for science. The Earth either revolves around the sun or it doesn't. That's a question for science that can be scientifically proven one way or another. And it was. The claim of the virgin birth of Jesus is not a question for science. And so what you can see here is that this guy is conflating those two. All right. And his concern was that if any traditional teaching of the church were undermined by new scientific discovery, then people might cast doubt on all traditional teachings of the church, and that would obviously fatally undermine the church. So obviously, as a church leader, he's concerned about that. It's understandable. But here's what he wasn't doing. He wasn't separating matters of science from matters of faith. And this is an important distinction. Whether you're a person of faith or not, it's still an important distinction for you to understand. Does the earth revolve around the sun or vice versa? That's a matter of science that can be proven or disproven through the scientific method. Some things cannot be proven or disproven. That's why those are matters of faith. That's the entire point of faith. Faith is about what's called unfalsifiable theses, a thesis that cannot be proven or disproven. That's why it's left up to faith. That's the point. All right. I don't need to ask someone if they have faith in gravity because gravity is a matter of science. You see the distinction? Now, the virgin birth, the physical resurrection of Christ, the assumption into heaven, the ascension of Christ, the assumption of Mary, whatever biblical accounts you're familiar with, but let's just stick with the virgin birth. That's what this guy was talking about. Now, you individually may say that the virgin birth is scientifically impossible. And a lot of people hold that belief. That's fine. Here's the point. It, the the virgin birth cannot be disproven. The resurrection of Christ cannot be disproven. It's an unfalsifiable thesis. You weren't there. You can't disprove it. Now, you can say, as many people do, that these are ridiculous fairy tales and you'd have to be an idiot to believe in them and but fine. Have fun, no problem. But you can't disprove them. That's the point. That's why they're matters of faith. You choose to believe them or not. They cannot be disproven. Geocentric theory can and was disproven. It's a matter of science. Now, as science progresses, more and more things that used to be matters of faith move into the lane of matters of science, if that makes sense. What causes a thunderstorm? That used to be a matter of faith, I guess. Now it's a matter of science. But certain things, the virgin birth, the resurrection, walking on water, can never and will never be disproven, short of inventing a time machine. Therefore, they're matters of faith. This guy in this quote was unable to make that distinction. Over time, religious people have gotten better at making that distinction. Um, this was a very common meme. Meme wasn't the word that was used back then, but you know what I mean. Um, from shortly after the 9/11 attacks that goes to this kind of modern back and forth between scientific worldview and religious worldview. So, as always, assess this critically. Is it true? How true is it? Is it leaving something out? Science will fly you to the moon, religion will fly you into a building. Okay, so let's break this apart critically. Did science fly us to the moon? Yes, the original moon program. We're supposed to be going back soon. I can't wait. But the Apollo program, the original moon program, was a scientific enterprise. Yeah, we didn't pray our way to the moon. And so, what the person who put this together and people who share this worldview, what they're saying is science brings incredible, remarkable progress, right? And flying to the moon is an example of that. And that's true. There's a lot of truth to that. Religion will fly you into a building. Was the young man who hijacked this plane that's about to crash into the World Trade Center, was he motivated by religion? Yes, he was. 100%. Nobody disputes that. Of course he was. So nothing here is inaccurate. It's the truth, but there is often a world of difference between the truth and the whole truth. So this construct here, they're not lying, but is it the whole truth? Is this a reasonable summary for you of what science and religion are responsible for? So this is a very idealized romantic view of science and a very pessimistic view of religion, of course, which a lot of people share, no problem. What else is religion responsible for? The greatest acts of charity for as we've covered in the course, for almost all of the history of human civilization, governments didn't do social services. So when you think religion, do you think about some maniac flying into the World Trade Center, or do you think about the fact that religious institutions have educated, cured, housed, fed, and cared for more humans than any institutions on earth, and it's not close? Governments come a distant second place when it comes to taking care of people. St. Jude's Children's Research Hospital is a religiously based enterprise, and they are responsible for radically decreasing the death rate for childhood cancers. That's what they specialize in. And this is an interesting mashup, I guess, because this is under the umbrella of the Catholic Church, as you can probably guess by the name, and they don't charge anyone any money for care. And they have, in my lifetime, decreased the death rate for childhood cancer from over 50% to about 10%. I don't care what anyone thinks about religion. Can we all agree that that's a objectively fantastic thing? Um, and that's religion at work. But here's the interesting mashup component. How are they saving the lives of these precious little children? Science. So, at least in the minds of some people, there's nothing contradictory about believing or embracing religious worldview and scientific worldview at the same time and combining them to do good. All right. So is religion responsible for some bad stuff? Oh, yeah, of course. We've covered some examples in this course. Is it also responsible for unbelievable acts of charity? Yes. How do you personally balance those out, right? Are there more benefits or more detriments? That's up for you to assess. And so science can do amazing things. It can fly us to the moon. You know what else science can do? It can give us the ability to destroy an entire city full of humans in a half a second. That's science. That's not great. So obviously you're going to have your own worldview, as you should. But I urge you, as always, be very careful about blanket statements and oversimplification. Science, good. Well, ask the people in Hiroshima. Religion, bad. Okay, ask the mother of a 2-year-old with leukemia whose life was saved free of charge by the Catholic Church. All right, assess these, of course, but be very careful about, oversimplifying an incredibly complex world. Dr. King spoke on this. Science investigate, religion interprets. Science gives man knowledge, which is power. Religion gives man wisdom, which is control. So he's talking about, in his view, and the view of many, um, they're both necessary. They both serve different functions. Science tells us how things happen, and we need to know how things happen. Religion is more about wisdom. Knowledge and wisdom are different. You can have all the knowledge in the world. You can know every fact available. You need wisdom to apply it appropriately and responsibly. That's much more complex. And that's Dr. King's view. And of course, as always, assess that for yourself. As science called some religious teachings into question, the Catholic Church began to ban and burn certain books that violated traditional Catholic belief. And so did all other religions during this period. And so, we talked about the printing press, we talked about information in general that is a threat to the establishment, whatever that establishment may be, whether it's a religious institution, whether it's a church, whoever it is. And you can see here they're burning books, and up top, my Latin isn't great, but this is an easy one. A list of prohibited books by Pope Benedict the 14th. Um, yeah, governments, religious institutions, right? They're going to censor information. We've covered that before. Galileo, he was the astronomer put on trial. He was forced to recant, to say that his information wasn't accurate, even though, of course, he knew that it was. And remember, what they were arguing about in this case, the astronomers in the church were arguing about, is the Earth the center of the universe or not? Neither one of them understood that their argument was almost irrelevant because they're looking at our solar system basically as the universe. They didn't have the technology yet to understand that, again, we're one random solar system in one random galaxy. They had no idea the scope of creation that we do now. And by the way, the more we learn about science, whether it's astronomy or whether it's about DNA or whatever it is, ask yourself, does that disprove the idea of a creator, or does that reinforce the idea of a creator? Galileo speaks on the intersection between science and religion. I believe he said that this at his trial. I do not feel obligated to believe that the same God who has endowed us with the senses, reason, and intellect has intended us to forego their use. So Galileo was a scientist and he was also very religious. And he's saying, look, God gave me this brain so that I could do science. And if we weren't meant to do science, why would our creator have given us the intellectual capacity to do science? That doesn't make any sense. That's kind of what he's saying there. Isaac Newton, everyone's heard of Isaac Newton. The law of universal gravitation. It's often afraid like, oh, he discovered gravity. That's dumb. It- He didn't discover gravity. Every 1-year-old baby discovers gravity the first time they try to walk and fall on their face. What he was able to quantify was the law of universal gravitation. The the fact that gravity is a law, meaning it is mathematical, it's quantifiable, and it is 100% knowable and predictable. Gravity doesn't do what gravity does 70% of the time, or 92% of the time, or 99.99999% of the time. Gravity does what gravity does 100% of the time. It's a law. So what's the significance? The universe is, to some degree, and it increases over time, it's understandable. It's coherence. It's not random. There are certain facts about, you name it, biology, chemistry, cosmology, whatever it is. There are certain facts that we can figure out that are quantifiable and expressible through mathematics and predictable, and they're right every single time. All those equations you had to learn in high school physics class. For me, it's been 30 years. I don't remember them. 1/2 mv squared or something. Those equations are right every time. They're not like, hey, follow this equation and you'll probably get it. No, no, no. They're laws. So the more people realize that there are laws of gravity, of momentum, of thermodynamics, whatever. Well, if there are rules, if there are laws, if there's a structure, where did it come from? Where did the structure come from? Where did the laws come from? Who, quote, wrote the laws? How did they, how did the universe get to be that way? Get to be understandable and quantifiable? How did that happen? So that creates a whole new lane of the debate between the scientific view and the traditional religious worldview. Now, here's another side-by-side image, and similar to the one I showed you of the science flies you to the moon, religion flies you into a building. They're using the same tactic, which is quite effective. Just be aware of it. Um, they're they're showing you two images side by side to try to lead you to a certain conclusion, which is very effective. So, what are they trying to get you to conclude here? And let's obviously think about whether it makes sense. On the left is a picture of a stained glass window, and on the right is a picture of a DNA strand, the double helix, kind of looking down into it. So, and you can see they're arranged to be right next to each other. They are presented in the same size. They're presented in a very similar format, right? To get your brain to zero in on the similarities, and there are similarities. They both have symmetry. They both have certain balances in the way color is distributed, right? In the DNA strand, I believe the colors represent the different proteins, A, G, C, T, I think. It's been a while, but right. The DNA strand on the right, it's symmetrical. You can cut it in half vertically and fold it over, and it's exactly the same. And the distribution of the colors of the proteins is that there's a pattern there. There's a pattern. It's not random. We can all stipulate that. We can see it just by looking at it. There's a pattern. And the same thing with the stained glass window. Now, the last thing we can stipulate by which I mean we can all agree with, regardless of our opinions on other issues. We can all agree, we can stipulate that the stained glass window was designed and created by an intelligent designer or creator. That stained glass window didn't randomly grow on a tree. That was designed for a specific purpose by a self-aware creator. We all know that. Now, here's where the debate comes in. Was the DNA strand, which also has symmetry and, predictable distribution of certain elements, was the DNA strand designed by a self-aware, intelligent creator, the same way that the stained glass window was? That's the question. And obviously, that's a very divisive question in terms of you're going to have a just intuitive answer to that, and they are mutually exclusive. The two worldviews that are presented by this question. When you see something like a DNA strand and the symmetry and the balance and all that, what does your gut tell you? Random or too, is it too coherent to be random? Does it imply intelligent design? And so there's different terms that are used for this debate. One term that comes up, random mutation, that's a phrase from Darwin when he's talking about biology, like random mutation and survival of the fittest and all that stuff. How do you explain the universe that we can perceive and all its complexity and everything that comes with it? Did it come about randomly? It's a purely material process with no rhyme or reason to it. It just it's just an unthinking material thing that sprang into existence and turned out the way it turned out randomly. Or the more science tells us about the universe, which is insanely more complicated than people used to think it was, does that imply to you that there must be some self-aware intention behind it, some intelligent design, which, as you probably know, is kind of shorthand for God in a theistic sense. So this image here is from an episode of The Simpsons. And you want to know how old I am? I'm so old that I remember when The Simpsons was funny. This is probably 30, 35 years ago. And what's pictured here in this ridiculous scene, I don't remember what was going on in this episode, but they're obviously playing on a certain thought exercise that I'll present to you. If you take that goes to this question, right? Random mutation versus intelligent design. If you take a room full of monkeys and put them all in front of a typewriter, and today it'd be a laptop, but you get the point, right? Room full of monkeys. Get 1,000 monkeys, put them in a room, give each one of them a laptop, and they are randomly mashing the keyboard. And it would be random. That's key. It's random because they're monkeys. They don't know what they're doing, right? They're just randomly smacking the keyboard. Okay. If you have 1,000 monkeys in a room for 1,000,000 years, will one of the monkeys eventually randomly write Romeo and Juliet? That's the question. And obviously, it's a rhetorical question. It's a thought exercise. Will one of the monkeys, given enough time, randomly, without any self-awareness, randomly write Romeo and Juliet? with every word spelled correctly, every indentation, punctuation mark, capitalization, everything to the letter. And in this analogy, Romeo and Juliet is the universe. For Romeo and Juliet to make sense, or any book, right? So they randomly picked Romeo and Juliet. For that to make sense, you can't just throw a bunch of letters out there. Everything has to be in order for it to be comprehensible, right? And so in this analogy, that's the universe. In other words, just like Romeo and Juliet has thousands and thousands and thousands of letters that all have to be in the right order and sequence for it to make any sense, the universe is the same way, in the sense that if there is if gravity's a little bit stronger or a little bit weaker, we don't exist. If radiation is a little bit higher or a little bit lower, we don't exist. If the sun is a little bit hotter or a little bit colder, we don't exist. If there's a little more salt or a little less salt in the ocean, we don't exist. If there's a little more nitrogen or a little less nitrogen in our atmosphere, we don't exist. And on and on and on. Is that random, or is that so unbelievably complex that it can't possibly be random? That's that's the thought exercise. And obviously you're going to come to your own conclusion. Governments began funding scientists during this period, and that continues today. Scientists are like artists. They need patrons. We talked about the Renaissance. Artists need patrons. So do scientists. It's hard to make a living being an artist. You need a patron. Science, probably even more so. If you're a scientist, you don't get paid $100 an hour by the science company to go to the factory and do science for 8 hours. That's not how that works. You need people to invest upfront for you to do really expensive research and development. And unlike artists, if you invest in an artist, someone hires you to, some patron hires an artist to paint a portrait, they're going to get the portrait. There is a return on investment there that's kind of guaranteed. You're going to get something. Um, if a patron hires and invests in a scientist to come up with some new medication, for example, there is zero guarantee on any return. You might get nothing. You might spend millions of dollars on research and development and get nothing. So it's a very risky investment. So that's why the government steps in. And what is government interested in using scientific advances to do? There are military applications, obviously, communication, agriculture, right? How can we use scientific advances to produce more food? We've gotten really, really good at that. Whether it's healthy food is an entirely different debate, but we've used science to produce obscene amounts of food, right? Starvation, compared to historically, starvation has been eradicated. Does it still happen occasionally? Yes, but compared to human history, starvation is done. It's incredible, and that's because of science. The military applications are, horrifying. The communications, unbelievable. You can instantly communicate with any other human on Earth because of science. The Enlightenment might be a term that you've heard. It kind of comes in tandem with the scientific revolution, and then there's a split, and the split is kind of alluded to here. The idea that the rules of the universe and of human nature could be discovered through the scientific method. Now, the thing in parentheses, we got to set that aside. The idea that the rules of the universe could be discovered through the scientific method, yeah, duh. That's what the scientific method is. That's the Enlightenment. You got Galileo, you got Isaac Newton. The rules of the universe can be discovered through the scientific method. We all know that. We haven't figured them all out yet. We've figured out a lot. Now, here's where it gets controversial, though. The idea that the rules of human nature can be discovered through the scientific method. raises the question, is there any such thing as human nature? Gravity is the law of gravitation is knowable and it's right 100% of the time. If I throw a ball up in the air, it's going to descend back towards me at the same speed 100% of the time. Is there anything in human behavior that is true 100% of the time? I can't think of one. Is there anything having to do with humans that you could write a mathematical equation for that's always true? Uh, no, I don't think so. And people that believe that human behavior can be scientifically controlled often end up becoming responsible for some of the worst crimes in human history. So that's an important, right? There's two lanes to the Enlightenment. There's the scientific lane, and then there's the human behavior lane, which is a lot less, well, it's a lot more complex, let's say. Um, Moral relativism is similar to cultural relativism, which we covered before. Um, it's very similar, actually, so we don't need to dwell on it. But it's more a kind of an individual level rather than at the level of a whole culture. Moral relativists began to look at truth and morality as relative rather than absolute. If anything was possible, who could say what was right or wrong? And so we covered relativism earlier. Um, the reason it's coming up now is that, look, a lot of things that were assumed to be true were just turned on their head, right? People assumed that the sun is moving because you can watch it move through the sky every day, and all of a sudden, all of a sudden it turns out it's not moving. Well, geez, if that's possible, anything's possible, right? That's the kind of relativist wedge here. And if anything's possible scientifically, then maybe anything's possible morally. We always thought the sun was moving, but it isn't. And we always thought, murder was wrong, but maybe that's not true either, right? So relativism. If you think back to cultural relativism, this is just kind of an offshoot of that. And as always, think about, in your personal opinion, what are the virtues to relativism? Maybe it gives us empathy and helps us keep an open minds. And then, of course, what are the potential dangers of relativism? If there's no such thing as wrong, what are the, is that potentially dangerous in your opinion? Right. So it's an interesting thought exercise. Um, I would personally urge you against marrying a moral relativist, but you have free will. Enlightenment thinkers developed the concept of deism. So this is where we'll kind of wrap this up here. Deism was a religious movement that was a reaction among some people to the scientific revolution, to all these new discoveries, which called into question certain traditional religious beliefs. So deists believe in a creator God rather than an interventionist God. And let me kind of show you the three lanes that this whole debate about worldview kind of split into here. Theists, those are people who believe that God is an active agent in our lives, and that would be, I'd say, the overwhelming majority of Jews, Christians, and Muslims would qualify themselves as theists, right? They believe in God, obviously, and they have the more traditional worldview that God is active in the universe and in our lives. Deists kind of separate off, and they have a term that God is the watchmaker. And that goes back to, at the time, if you ever seen an old pocket watch, a wind-up pocket watch, those were very common at the time. And that was kind of the analogy they used for the universe. So a pocket watch is a complex machine. If you look into it, it's got all these little gears, and it's obviously designed, right, by an intelligent creator. And it's a very delicate machine, and it has all these little gears, and everything needs to be in perfect balance for the machine to run, for the machine to work. And deists use that as an analogy for the universe, right? There's all these moving parts, and they have to be in perfect synchronicity and all that stuff. And they said the watchmaker. So in this analogy, the watch is the universe. It's an incredibly complex thing. And God is the watchmaker. God makes the watch intentionally, right? With a reason, and then winds it up to get it going. And then it starts ticking, and that's when creation begins. But then that's it. There's no intervention. All right. So that there's a distinction there between theism and deism. They both believe in a version of God, but have very different views on, they agree on creation, but they disagree on intervention. Right. And the third camp is atheism, which is there is no God. Life in the universe are random and purely material. And so that, if we go back to the monkeys and the laptops and Romeo and Juliet and all that stuff, the atheist view would be like, no, one of the monkeys eventually will write Romeo and Juliet. And our universe and all its complexity, well, it's just we're reading too much into it. If we think there's a purpose, it's just random material. Couple billion years ago, a carbon molecule did this to a argon nucleus. I'm just making up words and blah, blah, blah. And here we are. And it's a purely material view, random and material. And out of these three, a lot of things, as we've covered in the course, uh, are not mutually exclusive. Several things can be true at once. As far as I can tell, though, these three views are mutually exclusive. In other words, I don't think you could be two of these things at the same time. You kind of gotta pick one because they all contradict the other. Each one of these contradicts the other two. If you're one of them, you can't possibly be either of the others, right? If you are a theist or a deist, you obviously can't be an atheist. If you're an atheist, you obviously can't be a deist or a theist. They're mutually exclusive. So question one is, do you believe in God? Yes or no? If it's no, you're an atheist. If it's yes, then you need to pick between the two options of theism or deism. Um, in the West and in the world in general, atheism is increasingly popular, and one of the appealing things for many people about the atheist worldview is that it is very coherent. It's very coherent, and that's really attractive. It has an answer for everything, and the answer to almost every question in atheism is that there is no answer. And it's a closed loop, entirely coherent. There's no contradictions. It's very straightforward, and that's very appealing to a lot of people. Um, the debate. So again, as always, like read these three bullet points. Which of those intuitively makes the most sense to you? The modern kind of example of this debate that goes back to Galileo and the trial and all of this, right? Science, religion, how do they interact? What do we do with them? Can they coexist? All that stuff. Here's one last example of that. Uh, this guy's holding up a sign. Religion is killed. It's a very precise number. 2.229 billion people. Who are the real murderers? Religion, as we've covered, is responsible for a lot of really bad behavior. Who are the real murderers? Um, Atheists. That's the answer. That's the answer to that guy's question. If he's asking which worldview is responsible for more murder than any other worldview ever, the answer is atheists, specifically communists. That's the answer. Um, I want to be clear about a couple things. This does not, again, does not mean that religion isn't responsible for horrific levels of violence historically. It is. But this guy is asking a question, and the answer is atheism, specifically communism, which is a atheistic worldview, which is a responsible for the murder of 100 million people in the 20th century. That doesn't mean that atheism is inherently murderous. It just means that's the answer to that guy's question. Now, one possible explanation for why atheists murdered so many people in the 20th century goes back to something we covered earlier, which is the scientific revolution. In the 20th century, people had the scientific, technological ability because of the weaponry to murder previously impossible numbers of people. So I'm not saying it's the worldview, I'm saying it's the scientific revolution that makes mass murder at scale even possible. Um, so all of these ideas swirling about, intersecting, all this stuff, right? It's a lot. And wherever you settle on it, I just urge you to, be be nuanced and be careful about this. This guy with the sign, like, all right, man, we get your point. Yes, religiously inspired violence is very, very common throughout all of human history. We get it. We've read books too. The idea that rejecting religion, well, let me put it this way. In the 20th century, more people came to reject religion than at any point in human history. And what happened? It was the most violent century in the history of humanity. That's what happened. Um, last thing. Last thing? Yes, last thing. 1776. Kind of an important year. Adam Smith wrote The Wealth of Nations, and this is considered, in retrospect, the blueprint for modern capitalist theory. And some of the main ideas of capitalism: minimal interference by the state in the economy. So, in capitalist theory, practice is another thing. In theory, the answer to almost every question, what should the government do about fill in the blank? The answer is almost always nothing. Laissez-faire economics, leave it alone. Don't touch, don't touch. What should the government do about nothing? Leave it alone. The government should not, we talk about mercantilism, right? They're setting prices, they're setting up monopolies, they're buying and selling human beings. Don't do any of that. Just leave it alone. Laissez-faire. Do not intervene. Other economic theories call for escalating levels of intervention. We should set wages, we should set prices, we should have the government take over certain parts of the economy, et cetera, right? We'll end here with a quote, a really famous quote from this book: individual ambition serves the common good. And this is very often misunderstood, and it's often viewed as kind of incoherent. How could this be true? And it's often paraphrased, right? His quote is often changed into a much catchier, easier to assess phrase called greed is good. Greed is good. And a lot of people, when you hear that, like, how can greed be good? Greed's not a virtue. How can that be good, right? And so here's the theory, and as always, assess for yourself. How can greed be good? Uh, Example, Steve Jobs, iPhone. Why did he invent the iPhone? I don't know, but for the sake of this argument, let's assume it's because he wanted to get rich. Let's assume he was greedy. Did he get rich? Yes. And let's say, for the sake of argument, his driving motivation was greed, which is bad, right? We don't want to be greedy. That's bad, right? Okay, fine. The question is not, was he a good guy? By all accounts, he wasn't, but I don't know. Never met the guy. Let's assume, for the sake of argument, he was a horrible, terrible person that was motivated only by greed. Fantastic. The question is, how could that be good? Did you benefit from his greed? Let's say he was driven to create what he wanted to out of pure greed, and he was a terrible human. Did you benefit from him? And if I had to guess, the majority of you, the huge majority of you watching this, have purchased products that he invented and love them and are obsessed with them and can't imagine life without them. So, yes, you did benefit. So that's how, in theory, greed could be good. You benefit from the music of your favorite musical artists. That doesn't mean they're a good person. It means that society can be full of obnoxious, awful, greed-driven people that we can still benefit from, in theory. All right. So as always, ask yourself whether and to what degree that is true. I'm sure you can think of exceptions to that rule. All right. So that is the final unit, the entire history of Earth in like 12 hours. Um, but all joking aside, I hope you got something out of this and good luck.